He had failed to heal her once, not because he lacked skill or heart, but because the thing that needed mending was not physical, and she had fled before he could reach it. That truth lived like a bruise beneath everything that followed. An ache he didn't name out loud, a memory that returned at odd hours, pulling at the edges of his composure. Sophie Bennett sat in a plastic chair with vinyl seams that stuck to the back of her legs. The waiting room smelled of lemon disinfectant and the faint metallic tang that clung to hospitals no matter how many potpourri diffusers the administration bought. She kept her palms folded on top of a paper clipboard because that felt like control. If she held the pen between both hands, she could stop it trembling. If she let the pen roll free, she would let everything roll free. Memories, shame, the small, ridiculous voice that said she did not belong in places like this. Her name was called, and the world gated down to the stretch of linoleum from her chair to the exam room door. The fluorescent light hummed in that particular thin way that made skin look raw. The nurse, with a patient smile, asked about allergies and her address as if reading ink off a form was a way to know a person. "First time here?" the woman asked, eyebrows lifted as if Sophie might have the answer sewn into her sleeve. Sophie lied gently. Yes. Inside the exam room there was a wall-length poster of an anatomical drawing that looked too clinical to be comforting. Dr. Daniel Hayes stood at the sink, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his white coat crisp at the shoulders. He moved with the practiced economy of a man who had learned to make others feel steadied merely by not fussing. Everything about him suggested competence, the cut of his coat, the steady cadence to his voice, the way he listened without rescuing. He offered a brief, polite smile that lived behind an evenness, like a note held softly rather than a chord struck. Sophie noticed his hands, long, capable fingers, nails trimmed. Noticeable hands in a profession where hands were instruments of both science and care. He introduced himself and asked the questions a doctor must ask, but asked them in a way that was designed not to hurry, but to keep room for the patient. There was a small crease at the side of his mouth, a habit when he was trying to soften clinical sentences into something gentler. "You're very pale, Sophie," he said after a few minutes, the diagnostic voice hovering in and out of casual warmth. "Have you been feeling dizzy, lightheaded?" Sophie answered. Words scraped the back of her throat like sand. "Sometimes," she said, "I get tired. My heart." She stopped. She hadn't said this out loud before. For months she had been living with a low-grade ache under her ribs, a fatigue she blamed on late shifts at the bookstore, on weather changes, on bad luck. Saying it made it feel like she had named a thing that could be judged. He asked about family history and medication. There were so few answers she could offer. Her life was tidy and small. She worked 3 blocks from the apartment she could just barely pay for. She lived in the second-floor walk-up that creaked in winter. She drank too much instant coffee and read thrift store novels by lamplight. She had never learned to speak as if any of that mattered in rooms with degrees on the wall. He suggested tests, things done in the background that might explain fatigue and faintness. He explained them simply. He did not glance at her chest or make clinical assumptions, and he did not reach for intimacy as though that could cure a tired heart. He wrote an order, folded the paper with a practiced motion, and told her to make an appointment for follow-up. Sophie listened, but part of her was already running. It wasn't the first time someone had peered into the slow spaces of her life and looked for a lever she could pull to fix what was wrong. Men had told her, less kindly, that she was too quiet, that she didn't smile in the right places. Employers had looked at her thin resume and told her it wasn't the right fit. There was a version of herself who had learned to vanish small disagreements with the world by making herself small. She left the clinic, and the light from the street felt too bright, as if the city were a place for people who had not been cataloged into waiting rooms. The sidewalk jarred beneath her. She held the folded order in her fingers until it flexed the skin. Someone in a suit passed and smiled a practiced smile at a passerby, and Sophie suddenly felt like a visitor in her own life. She sat on a bench outside with the paper cup of coffee she'd bought on impulse. She watched people move through their days, warm and uninterrupted, and she thought if she stayed in that bench forever, she could pretend the appointment had never happened. When she reached her apartment, the paper stuck to her hands from the leftover coffee. She folded the test order and put it in the junk drawer with napkins and a spare hair tie. The drawer closed with a small thunk that sounded to her like an end. 2 weeks came and went in the light, the hum of the bookstore, and the rusted ritual of her life. She wrapped paperbacks and shelved them with careful fingertips. She rearranged displays according to the owner's exacting aesthetic. She sometimes read the synopses out loud in the quiet after long customers, pretending to be a patient lecturer of some book club degree. The days slid into each other, and she told herself she had put the clinic in the drawer like the order, that she had every intention of going back, but that there was no horizon around the next paycheck. Then, one humid afternoon, she left the shop with a weighted dragging at the base of her skull. The rain had come through the night like a remembered promise, and the air had gone heavy. Her limbs felt like they were moving through syrup. On the corner, a bus whooshed past, and a wave of dizziness blurred the storefronts into watercolor. Someone's umbrella brushed the side of her face, and for a breath she could not tell where her skin ended and the air began. She made herself the usual list of things to do: buy milk, schedule shifts, iron a shirt. And then the world narrowed to the small, insistent pain and a cold that had nothing to do with weather. She steadied herself against the brick of a building and tried to count to 10 until the dizziness subsided. It did not. She told herself she could go back to the clinic, and that was when she realized the shrunk truth under her excuses. Being sick demanded visibility, and visibility demanded a version of herself she did not trust to be seen. But this time she went. The receptionist recognized her from the last visit and asked the same questions with the same practiced politeness. Sophie took the form and pressed the pen into the paper until the cartilage of her finger ached. The nurse weighed her, took a blood pressure that pulsed in the cuff like an admonition. Daniel Hayes opened the exam door before she could. He looked up from his laptop, and there was that measured glance that arranged her into a set of facts with a human face. He took her hand briefly to guide her further into the room, not as a claim, but as a practical gesture, warm and unobtrusive. The contact lasted only a second, but it left a small ember of steadiness behind. "You're back," he said. The phrase was almost a question. No surprise, no reproach, just a notation. Sophie sank onto the exam table with the paper crinkling beneath her and tried to put her breath into order. He listened. He asked about the fainting. He asked about food intake, about sleep. When he reached for the stethoscope, he did so with a professional calm that erased the flicker of embarrassment she always felt when a stranger touched her torso in the name of health. His hands were practiced, sure, touch that had been trained to be careful. "Let's run a few screenings," he suggested. "Nothing invasive. We'll take it step by step." He explained the tests in terms that did not sound frightening: a blood draw, monitoring, a chart of symptoms to tick off. He wrote a prescription for rest and hydration like it was a kind command, handed it to her with both hands as one would hand over a fragile thing. There was no lingering smiles, no suggestive word. Everything he did was calibrated to keep the boundary clear and the patient respected. She left with a bill folded into her pocket and a list of instructions she did not want to read. When she walked back to the street, the sky had thickened to pewter. At the corner, the cafe next door to the clinic steamed sugar and fried pastry. It was the kind of place Sophie visited when friends dragged her out, and she let herself sit around the edges of conversations. She had come to prefer the small square table by the window where the light fell warm and the English muffin crumbs pinned themselves into the grain of the wood. She thought of calling in sick to the bookstore and then not doing it. She thought of lying on her couch and letting the afternoon leak away. She thumbed a small photograph in her wallet that held a straggling memory of childhood. A father with a crooked grin holding a birthday cake, candles bright, and the smoke scent that reminded her of old kitchens. The photograph was an anchor. It reminded her she had been held enough to survive being small. When she stepped into the cafe, it smelled like brown sugar and wet wool. The barista greeted her by name. She had the face of someone who assigned regulars to memory. And Sophie slid into the window seat, her shoes tapping the tiled floor until she felt present in the world again. She had not yet been there a full minute when Dr. Daniel Hayes walked in. He had changed the white coat for a navy blazer that fit him like a second skin, and his hair was less restrained, a casual look that softened the clinical edges. He ordered without looking anxious, and then glanced around politely, and when he saw her, he hesitated for a second, the way a man does when he is not sure he should cross a room. "May I?" he asked, nodding to the empty chair across from her. She frowned, because this should have been against all her instincts. He had been her doctor 2 hours ago. The ethics of such proximity twined in her head like vines. But he had not been offhand. He had been careful in the clinic. And the rest of the world had those strange moments where separate spheres of life collided on neutral ground. "Sure," she said, "if you don't mind." He sat with a quiet making of space, hands folded around a cup of coffee that steamed in a way that suggested deliberate leisure. He spoke slower than he did in the clinic, as if trying on a different cadence. His laugh, when he let one out, was shorter and more surprised than the efficient smile he'd offered before. He was disarmingly human, the same neat stride, the same hands, but with warmth threaded through the edges. They spoke about safety pins and favorite books and the oddities of the neighborhood. He was the kind of listener who didn't wait for pauses to set in. He filled them with ease, but he never pushed. He complimented her on the way she spoke about a book's characters, on the care she took in recommending titles to customers. He revealed in small, incidental ways that he read for pleasure, that his favorite cafe table was the one he now occupied, that he had designed an after-school program for reading comprehension in low-income neighborhoods because he believed in small, daily nudges toward better days. Sophie told herself she was merely engaging in social niceties. She had learned to protect her heart by keeping talk to the safe shorelines of the banal. But she was also experiencing something rarer, a person making room for her. Not a savior, not a fixer, but a steady presence who seemed to enjoy the shape of her sentences. At one point, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, and the line of his jaw shifted, a micro-expression that matched the habit of a man who split his life between public obligations and private hours. On the screen flashed a message preview with an urgent tone. He read it, then put the phone back, an apology resting unspoken in the way he closed his hands. "You don't have to tell me if you're busy," she said. I should go." He smiled then, but it was not the guarded smile of a man on duty. "No," he said. "Sit, stay. He hesitated, which was new. His usual sentence endings were tidy. "It's nice to take a moment that isn't about charting or timing. It helps me remember the rest of life exists." She laughed at that, a small sound that felt like finding a knot in a sweater. They ordered another round of coffee, and the conversation leaned into trivialities and then into something that felt like honesty. He spoke about the sharpness of being a young doctor in a hospital where expectations sat like a second skin. He spoke in a softened tone about burnout and why he had started a small clinic that focused on empathy as much as protocol. He admitted, without the need for dramatics, that his family had expectations. Money, legacy, the grooming toward something that did not always feel like choice. Sophie found the cracks in his armor enticing because they were tiny and real. He was affluent without brandishing it, no ostentation, just things that hinted. A watch with a beaten-in sheen, the quiet tailoring of his blazer, a credit card that looked like it had seen 100 dinners around the world. It did not feel like bragging. It felt to her like an accidental truth that required interpretation. There was a delicate moment when he reached forward to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear because it had annoyed her for the last 5 minutes. The gesture was the kind that meant something different depending on who performed it. With strangers, it could be presumption. With friends, it could be intimacy. With lovers, it could announce future claims. In that movement, Sophie felt the line between what had been safe and what might become terribly vulnerable. She told herself she would not build anything from the few hours of conversation. She had built enough fantasies to furnish an apartment, and they all came with the same noise, disappointment stepping in sideways when reality arrived. But for the first time since he had labeled her tests and given her instructions, a different thought threaded through her chest. He had not tried to fix her. He had listened. They left the cafe with the casualness of people who had found a shared corner of the world. He offered to walk her back part of the way, and she declined with a small smile, not because she wanted the distance, but because she was building a boundary like one would build a scaffold around a fragile flower. He nodded in understanding, as if boundaries were a language he treasured. Over the next days, her mind picked at the memory of him like a scab. She could not unnotice the way he had smiled when she spoke of characters in a book as if she were introducing him to friends. She felt a warmth at the memory of his hands, a dull, pleasant ache that came from being seen. She started, against better judgment, to watch for him, in the park, outside the clinic, or in the doorway between shelves. The thought made her feel guilty, as if someone might accuse her of trying to catch light with a jar and expect it not to spill. One morning, while shelving a stack of romance novels at the back of the shop, Sophie saw a print magazine propped against the counter. The cover pictured a handsome man in a navy blazer with a headline that read, "For all the world to see," a profile about a successful medical entrepreneur who had transformed clinics into community spaces. Her hands went cold. She snatched the magazine and pretended to be interested in a blurb on page 3, but the pull was already there. She turned the page. His face stared up at her in a glossy photograph, a portrait of composure. The caption named him Dr. Daniel Hayes. The article described his beginnings, modest, the pull to medicine, the shift into entrepreneurship. It spoke of his clinic's success, and, in the margin, a small off-handed line about his recent philanthropic ventures. Somewhere beneath the text, he had been labeled a self-made millionaire. The words sat in the white space as if they were definitive and forever. She felt strangely betrayed by ink and layout. The man she'd sat across from was richer, certainly, than the corner of the world she inhabited. Worse, she interpreted the detail as a verdict. Men like him were not the people who courted bookstore clerks with calloused fingertips. Men like him had polished trophies and publicists. That night she went home and lay on her back until the ceiling blurred, and she thought about the economy of attraction and how rarely it was measured by love and by how often it was measured by what someone could provide. The more she tried to calm the thought, the louder it became. If people thought she was with him because of money, what would that say about her own reasons? Had she been naive to let herself enjoy coffee with a man whose life contained savings terms she could not imagine? The magazine became an accuser. She found herself replaying the cafe conversation and aligning sentences with motives she had never suspected existed. The ambiguity of kindness, because no people were monoliths, gave way to a narrower explanation. Perhaps he had looked kindly at her because he liked how she made him feel. Or perhaps he had been doing what wealthy men did best, collect moments that looked like kindness and call them connection. She had no proof either way, only a stomach that rumbled with the weight of suspicion. When she came into work, she found herself abruptly professional with customers, her voice clipped by concentration. She avoided the window seat in the cafe that afternoon and spent her break in the fluorescent back room of the shop, where the light flattened everything into manageable shapes. The magazine lay under the counter like a talisman she could pretend not to see. He noticed. That was the thing about people who paid attention. They could read the small alterations in one's gait, the way shoulders climbed in on themselves. Daniel noticed that when Sophie moved through their shared neighborhood in the following days, she kept her head lower and her smile tighter. He had not known the depth of her modesty at the start. He had assumed, with the arrogance of someone trained to read symptoms, that she was shy. He now wondered if he had mistaken retreat for something else entirely. He had come from a place where consequence and image mattered. His family had expectations that braided through the language of every holiday and reunion. He had learned to measure his words and actions against a public ledger. But that did not mean he was made of glass. The idea of Sophie constructing a smaller world to fit pain into gnawed him because he knew what it felt like to hide grown parts of oneself in a pocket. He began to see her warily and with the kind of attention that made things feel deliberate rather than accidental. He'd volunteer for shifts at the community reading program because she had mentioned loving to read to children, even though he could hire someone better trained and the program would run the same. He'd leave a small book at the bookstore's front table with a note in his handwriting that said, simply, "A good read," in case she liked it. He kept his distance in the clinic, maintaining the boundary between doctor and patient, but he did not stop being present outside it. Sophie noticed those small things as if they were footprints in snow. They were not impressive. They were not gilded declarations or expensive dinners. They were the sort of modest courtesies that belonged to people who pursued without demanding. She felt equal parts flattered and disquieted. The magazine label had a weight that did not let her enjoy a good gesture without immediately politicizing it for motive. A week after the article, a small winter storm dropped wet leaves into the gutters and the city smelled of asphalt. She found a blue hardcover book on the front table of the bookstore when she opened that morning. A sticky note wrapped around the spine with her name wrote on it, "For Sophie. If you like quiet, I think you'll like this. D.H." She held the book in her hand like contraband. The handwriting was the same as the note he'd tucked into her coffee cup the week before. She traced the letters slowly because the act felt illicit. It was easier to imagine a friend leaving such things than a man whose last name was in magazine glossies. She tried to ignore it, to shelve it like any other pretense of attention. A day passed, then another. The offers of presents remained modest, and yet her suspicion grew like a careful vine around something tender. One evening she caught herself standing at the window watching him leave the cafe across the street, his coat collar pulled up against a cold wind, and felt suddenly foolish for caring. She told herself to stop, but the wanting was almost addictive, a soft pain that announced she was alive in a way that shelving books never was. Daniel, for his part, was careful in his curiosity. He had seen patients come to him wrapped in a dozen protective shells. Anger that masqueraded as politeness, silence that read as apathy. Sophie was different because she surrendered small slivers of trust without offering herself wholly. It made him want to be steady rather than spectacular. He had been spectacular once in a relationship, lavish with gifts and gestures to insulate himself from the knowledge that his lover had been more in love with the lifestyle than with him. It had ended with him learning that wealth could shield a person from themselves, that generosity without emotional honesty was only debt in disguise. He did not want that again. So he practiced being unremarkable in the ways that mattered. He showed up at the bookstore with a single, modest bouquet of wildflowers when Sophie mentioned the owner's birthday. He stayed a respectful distance. He asked about her shift with a genuine tilt of interest. He was careful about the clinic. He never merged their appointment time into moments of private conversation that could be misread. But if the world has a way of throwing people together, it also has a way of making them collide. An afternoon came when Sophie went to a bookstore reading and found herself sitting 3 chairs away from him in an audience of 30. She could feel her cheeks heat in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with being seen. The author read the first paragraph of a story, and the words seemed to knit the room into a small shared warmth. Throughout the reading, he blinked in the same passages, his jaw slackening at the same sentence as if he felt the same stitch of surprise. She noted every micro-movement, an inventory that was half affection and half anxiety. Afterward, people piled into the small bar for wine and conversation. He approached her then with the softness of someone who had spent time considering the right thing to say. "You liked the part about the woman who rearranged her grief into small domestic rituals," he said. She did. She realized she had nodded, a small reflexive agreement. "I like the way the author made the ordinary feel like a freeze frame," she said, feeling the thrill of being in sync with someone in a room full of voices. They walked out into dusk together, and for a moment it felt like the sky had been edited to a warmer hue. He spoke about a foundation he had started to fund small libraries in underserved neighborhoods, and she listened with the slow attention of someone who measures people not by headline, but by their small transactions of kindness. She found herself telling him about a reading circle she volunteered for on the weekends, how children there repeated stories back like treasures, and how sometimes their insistence on wonder made her breathe differently. He listened as if each revelation mattered. And yet, just when the evening hinted at kindness's next stage, the magazine cleft lay between them like a secret. For Sophie, the article had been a gauge of their difference. For him, it was simply a fact of life. He understood tension the way a doctor understood fever, an indicator, not a condemnation. He was, admittedly, uncomfortable with the specifics of his public image intruding into the quietly stitched world she inhabited. "Listen," he said gently, when she lingered at the edge of telling him the thing about feeling unworthy. "I don't want you to feel—" He stopped because he didn't want to make assumptions, because he had been trained to let patients name their own pain. "I don't want you to feel like I came into your life with a mission. I came because I like spending time with you." It should have been simple. It wasn't. She was not used to being told that someone liked the uncomplicated cadence of her company without any promised exchange. She wanted to ask him if he meant it, how he could mean it. She wanted to ask him if being a man like him had ever made him feel alone. Instead, she felt old scripts tug at her. Men like him were not made for quiet corners. Men like him were made for stages. Their conversation tapered into night. Goodbyes were said with the kind of cautious tenderness that comes when people don't know how big they want to let their hope be. Sophie walked home under the nervous stars with a sense of being both exposed and oddly protected. The next day at work, she found a tiny receipt for coffee in the trash. The barista had kept track of the time Daniel had sat at the window, a detail that suddenly felt like a proof in a court of domestic credibility. Days folded into weeks with the measured repetition of small things. He continued to show up without fanfare. She found notes slipped into the spine of books she would never have chosen for herself, as if he wanted her to test the edges of what she might like. She read them, and sometimes she liked them. Sometimes she returned them to the shelf with a faint, private smile. And yet the ache of being measured by what he had continued to worry at the edges of her day. The magazine had labeled him publicly as something she could not be sure she wanted to try to be in partnership with. She worried she was stepping into a story already written by society, where people with different lives paired for the wrong reasons and then pressed their differences like a bandage over the hurt they refused to speak of. One rainy afternoon, she opened her phone to a notification and found a social media post that had been shared by a friend. A photograph of Daniel, smiling with a plaque in his hands at some charity gala, blinked back at her among the comments. She closed the app and tried to breathe, but the site felt like a rupture. The private man she'd met in cafes and between shelves now existed in a frame that glittered with other people's approval. She confronted the loneliness she felt, that subtle, empty place the world filled with diagrams of success that made no room for ordinary love. She took a long, shaky breath and told herself she could choose to step away. She could concede that their lives were on different planes and shelve the whole thing like an unstartable book. When she came to the shop that night, her hands trembled over the cover of the book she'd been saving. She had kept it in her locker like a secret. She pressed it against her chest and felt the crush of small, ordinary life and the vastness of the gulf between them. She folded the corner of the page where she had left off and told herself, not for the first time, that she needed time. He noticed the coolness in the messages he received. Her replies had gone from brisk and curious to brief and guarded. He felt, when he read them, the old past flaring in the shape of a man whose wealth had been a barrier before, someone who had once offered levels of generosity to insulate himself from loneliness and found it had been an expensive counterfeit for intimacy. He did not want to bargain with that again. On a Wednesday evening, he stood outside the bookstore with his hands in his pockets and watched the thin light under the doorway like a private cinema. He saw Sophie shift inside. She looked smaller, as if she was trying on a different coat to protect herself from the cold. His heart gave a small, painful lurch at the sight. He had not, in his calculations, predicted the tenacity of his concern. He had planned to be kind and then reasonable, a presence like a steady road rather than a series of dramatic gestures. But at the sight of her retreating, moving away slowly into the habits of someone who kept their distance, something more stubborn took hold. It was not merely attraction. It was the embarrassment of a man who had been unable to make someone feel safe under his care. He had known the clinic could only do so much. He had been tempted a dozen times to prove he was not like the men who had loved wealthy things more than people. He had been tempted to build a gesture so large it would erase any doubt. Instead, he folded the card into his wallet and placed a small personal reminder beneath it: presence, patience, constancy. He walked to the clinic with a steady step and a resolve that felt quieter, deeper. Sophie watched the street from her second-story window that night and tried to imagine what his life looked like beyond the photos and headlines. She pictured rooms that had been painted by other people's expectations, dinners arranged with people who spoke currency as if it was a language separate from love. She wondered if he had once paid for affection and found, like many men did, that purchases could not replace the messy work of being known. That possibility softened the edge of suspicion she had worn like armor. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a little hope. Not a blaze of certainty, but a small candle she could tuck into a cup and shield from the wind. She let herself imagine a man who had failed to heal, not because he lacked the tools, but because healing required consent and time. She let herself imagine that someone might decide, despite everything, that she was worth the slow, careful work of being remembered. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, the bookstore's lamp cast the familiar circle of light on pages that had kept her company since she was a girl. She opened the book he had left and read a paragraph about a woman who learned to stitch her grief into a new dress. She smiled, halfway to a laugh, and felt the small, combustible warmth of possibility kindle where it had been ash. She kept the card folded in the pocket of her cardigan for almost a week, a small, warm secret that warmed her thigh when she moved. She told herself she was practicing caution. She told herself she would allow a friendship to form, no more. But a friendship with the kind of attention Daniel gave felt like stepping onto a bridge whose far side she could not yet see. She read and reread the card at odd moments. For when you need company. The handwriting felt like an invitation and a test, both. For Daniel, the card had been a marker. He watched her from the edges of neighborhoods and nights, cataloging the tiny ways she softened around bookshelves, the way she hummed when a line in a poem landed, the way she folded her hands when she tried not to agonize about things that could not be fixed with a prescription. Watching someone live quietly was not a dramatic endeavor. It required patience and the stubbornness to show up without expecting transformation. He had learned, painfully, that a grand gesture could be misread as transaction. So he stayed small, a packet of loose-leaf tea on her counter when she mentioned insomnia, a handwritten list of neighborhood walks pinned to the bookstore corkboard, a recommendation for a restful playlist scrawled on the back of a receipt. Still, there were days when his restraint wore thin. He found himself rehearsing questions about her childhood that he didn't want to ask, pausing at doorways to see if she passed. The ache he carried was not only desire, it was regret. He believed, with the quiet stubbornness of someone trained to respond to human frailty, that there were parts of people maps could not chart. He had failed, if that was the right word, because he could not, in a single appointment, coax from her what she needed to heal. He had been a competent clinician when she sat on the exam table, but he wasn't the kind of person who could stitch someone's whole past in one sitting. The failure felt private and heavy, not a malpractice, but an ethical ache, a professional disappointment that had followed him home and sat at the edge of his life like an unanswered letter. Sophie kept thinking about failure the way one thinks about a bruise, sore in memory, but not always visible. Sometimes she wondered whether the memory of fleeing the clinic had marked her as someone inherently broken. Other times she resented that a stranger could hold that moment like a truth about her. More often, she folded the thought under layers of work and novels and founding small, precise pleasures, mending a torn page, recommending the exact book for a shy teenager, eating grilled cheese in the quiet between customers. The collapse happened on an ordinary Thursday. Sophie had worked a double shift because the owner was short-staffed and because she'd been trying to make the rent a fraction safer this month. The morning had been a slow rain of customers and the low hum of the shop's heater. By mid-afternoon, her limbs felt heavy, the kind of deep fatigue that no amount of caffeine could disguise. She drank water between transactions, but it slid through her like a clear apology. A customer asked for a specific edition of a novel, and Sophie climbed the ladder to retrieve it with a careless eagerness that made her misjudge the rung. The ladder pitched. Her head felt soft and far away. She caught her breath and then could not catch it again. She remembered the ceiling for a moment, white paint flaking near the light fixture, the faint smear of a shadow like a cloud, and then the smell of coffee, and the startled shout of someone behind her, and the leather of the ladder against her palms. One of the staff ran forward, someone else called for an ambulance. There was a blurring sequence of hands and of air, and then the world went thin as paper. Paramedics arrived, efficient and brisk, in the way of people trained to contain panic. They checked her vitals, asked quick, clear questions she couldn't answer. They said words she heard like wind: dehydration, low blood pressure, exhaustion. They moved her carefully, placing a blanket over her legs, speaking to the staff with the precise tone of professionals who know emergency can be ordinary and ordinary can be deadly. As they lifted her onto the stretcher and wheeled her through the shop, she caught a glimpse of the rows of books and thought, absurdly, of all the stories she'd been saving for someone else's boredom. She felt a flicker of embarrassment. So theatrical, she thought. Then nothing at all, until the ambulance lights blurred the rain into blue streaks. News traveled faster than she liked. Daniel heard of an unconscious woman taken from a local bookshop while he was between afternoon clinic rounds. He was not on call, but the clinic administrator had phoned with clipped concern, and the name Sophie Bennett rang in him like a bell. He left immediately, sweat blooming at the temple from a different kind of urgency than he expected. Less professional duty than something more personal, an ache he'd refused to name. At the hospital, the emergency room moved with its own colder rhythm. Sophie woke to fluorescent light and the slow, mechanical rhythm of a monitor that counted out heartbeats like a stubborn metronome. Her throat felt dry. The room tasted like antiseptic and tired cotton. Faces loomed and receded. Doctors speaking in clipped tones. A nurse adjusting an IV line with the practiced ease of someone who has steadied 1,000 trembling limbs. She tried to focus, to organize, to remind herself that this had happened and that it would pass. Then she saw him. He stood near the foot of her bed with his coat folded over one arm, as if the coat itself were containing his composure. His eyes, the same steady gray she had learned to read like weather, were soft with a concern that had no clinical edge. When he caught her looking, he exhaled, a small human sound that loosened something in her chest. "I checked in," he said, voice low. "You're in good hands here." He faltered, and for the first time she saw the man who preferred to be precise become slightly unmoored. "I came as a friend." A nurse stepped forward, the boundary of professional space reasserting itself. Daniel nodded once to the team and then looked at Sophie with a steadiness that did not demand anything. It was dehydration, a doctor announced, explaining nothing she had not guessed from their previous conversation. She'll need rest, fluids, and observation. No complications apparent. That last part felt like a small commutation of guilt. Sophie blinked and found her eyes watering, equal parts fatigue and embarrassment. Daniel took her hand. This time, not a practical guide in a clinic, but a warm presence, and squeezed gently. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said. "I can wait." Something in the room lifted, an honesty that had been postponed until the crisis cleared away the polite curtains. In the quiet that followed, with the monitor a slow whisper, he told her about his impatience with the life he had been offered. Strings of engagements, dinners planned by handlers, the misreading of his charitable work as ego. He told her in patient fragments about a past that had left him wary, a relationship that had felt like living behind glass, where his partner fell in love with the reflection of ease rather than the man behind it. He did not dramatize, he simply set the facts down like stones across a stream. "I thought I could fix things fast," he said. "Maybe I believed in quick solutions more than I should have. With you, I realize some things don't respond to a single visit. They need time. They need someone to keep showing up." His fingers ran along the back of her hand as if to prove his point. Sophie listened to the cadence of his confession. It was so plainly offered that she had to guard her instinct to look for secret motives. He had nothing to win in that hospital room from words offered quietly like that. He could have been the man of grand statements, the one who erased doubt with a headline. Instead, he was raw in a way that made her feel both seen and small, which she now learned were not opposites but companions. She felt the pull of trust like a tide. The cautious spine of her past had lined itself with stories of men who loved the idea of love more than the person. This man, though, spoke of his failures with the odd humility of someone who had been taught to apologize by experience rather than posture. He told her things he could have hidden, about his fear of buying affection, and about the private grief he'd felt when generosity had been mistaken for vulnerability. He admitted that there was a part of him that had been terrified of being the kind of man who could not be chosen for who he was. "I failed to do right by you the first time," he said softly, looking straight at her, "the first time he named the bruise the way it needed naming. Not because I didn't care, but because you left and I wasn't ready to reach you where you were. I thought I could set things right with care plans and follow-ups, but you were asking for a kind of steadiness I hadn't learned to give." Sophie felt a startling mix of relief and grief. Relief because she could finally hear the truth that had lived between them. Grief because the truth was small and tender and had taken a collapse to surface. She answered him with the clipped honesty that had kept her safe all her life. "I didn't want to be fixed," she said, hearing the tremor in her own voice. "I didn't want someone to look at the pieces and tell me how to be whole. I ran because I had learned people could rearrange me into what they wanted. I needed to decide to let someone in." The conversation steered away from medical charts and into a shared place of missteps. He told her he kept coming not to alter her, but to stand witness to who she was. He did not demand anything. He only wanted to be honest about the fact that the memory of her had lodged somewhere in him, stubborn and luminous. "I think about you in ways that make my life better," he admitted. "Not because I imagine you will change anything for me materially, but because knowing you makes me behave better. It makes me less eager to hide. It makes me kinder, not because I have to be, but because I remember how small acts mattered to you." She considered the words, the way they reframed all the small notes and books he'd left. He wasn't trying to collect something he could display. He was trying to become the sort of man who could be trusted with someone else's small needs. "I don't know if I can promise anything more than that," he said quietly. "But if you let me, I will keep showing up. I'll keep being small and present. If that's not enough, tell me and I'll step back." Sophie let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. There was tenderness in his restraint, and it steadied a part of her that had forgotten how to lean. "Show up," she said finally, "not to fix me, just to be there." The hospital time blurred into a slow, gentle recovery. Nurses measured, staff checked, and a small regimen of rest and fluids did its patient work. Daniel did not hover like a storm. He visited with a plainness that bordered on reverence. A thermos of tea in a cloth bag, a paperback waiting on the bedside table, a letter that read like a short story about a man learning how to make small commitments. Sometimes he sat in the chair and read aloud silly passages that made her laugh. Other times he simply watched her sleep, as if cataloging the line of her face like it might otherwise vanish. When she left the hospital a few days later, they walked out into a sunlight that seemed to have decided to be gentler after the rain. Sophie balanced herself with a new steadiness. She had been offered a choice: pull back into the privacy that had protected her for years, or step into a cautious communal life where trust could be tried and possibly rewarded. She chose, with a small, steady courage, to keep him on the margin of that life. The months that followed were not cinematic sweeps of impossibly arranged romance. They were ordinary. Coffee in the same soft murmured cafe, rain-drenched walks beneath shared umbrellas, quiet afternoons rearranging bookshelves together, his hand finding hers at the end of a sentence and neither pulling away. Instead of grand weeks of intense passion, they built a slow accumulation of days that felt like tidying a house together. It was in the small tasks, the mending of a hem, the making of soup when her throat tightened, the way he learned the exact angle she liked her reading lamp, that intimacy settled into habit. Daniel's wealth receded again into the background. He paid for nothing showy. If he bought a dinner, it was at a modest restaurant where the menu was handwritten and the lighting made his jaw look less like sculpture and more like someone who had had too few solid meals as a child. He insisted, gently, on practices that made the relationship feel mutual. When her salary fell short one month, he offered to cover the rent, but only if they signed a small, pragmatic loan between them. Words on paper that glanced at pride and said, "For now, we will both be accountable." Sophie hated the intimacy of the ledger, but accepted it because he had framed the help as trust, not purchase. She began to trust being seen in ways she had not allowed. She told him about the nicknames she'd had as a child, about a mother who left when she was too young to file grief into language, about a brief, intense relationship in college that had taught her sex could be both tender and ruinous. He listened, and when he could not help, he apologized with a humility that continued to astonish her. He did not fix, he honored. He told her more of his own story, too. He described the slow accumulation of a career that began with scholarships and late nights in hospital libraries. He admitted how he had once equated doing more for others with knowing his worth. He had given until care became currency. She grinned at the confession, recognizing in him someone trying to relearn value without performance. They both held their histories like maps, useful, accurate, and with some roads marked as safer to avoid. There were tests of trust. She met his friends, practical, sometimes brusque people who had been in his life since residency. He met hers, the bookstore owner who had a habit of tea-dipping his questions, the reading circle kids who insisted she read the same book 3 times and then recited half of it back. They negotiated the Sunday rituals and the small irritations. His need for early bedtimes after long shifts, her habit of leaving mismatched socks in the laundry. They learned how to apologize without resentment and how to offer space when either of them needed it. One rainy afternoon, 6 months after the hospital, Daniel asked if she would go to the cafe where they had first sat and talk. He had chosen that table with an almost religious care, a corner where the light slanted the same way it had the first time they had sat there. Sophie felt a flutter of the old fear, the magazine headlines, the societal scripts, but the months had layered their own evidence. The nights he had shown up because he said he would. The mornings he had left her notes when she woke early. The way his eyes softened when she told a story poorly and he hung on to the mistake as if it were sacred. They ate quiet food, warm, simple, and when the plate between them had been cleared, he reached into his coat. Sophie braced herself automatically for the kind of spectacle that cost more than attention. But what came out was small. A plain box, the kind that could hold 2 rings, but also could hold a bookmark. He slid it across the table with both hands, eyes bright but unshowy. "I am not good at ceremonies,"